She was 21 and homeless. No family who would claim her, no plan beyond the next hour, just a canvas bag she'd sewn herself and $10 folded 3 times at the bottom of it. And with that $10, she bought an abandoned ferry house at the end of a gravel spit in Gray Harbor, Maine, in a corner of the coast, so forgotten that the nearest paved road was 4 miles away. The roof over the wheelhouse was half gone. The well had not been tested in 60 years. The Pelham County clerk said the building had been locked and waiting since 1962 and wasn't worth the cost of tearing down. But what nobody knew was that up in the old wheelhouse, hidden inside a sealed compass binnacle cabinet that hadn't been opened in over 60 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if you love these stories as much as we love telling them, we have something special for you. 12 brand new stories, never released on YouTube, only available to the people who support this channel directly. Each one a full, quiet road story, just like this one. You will find the link in the description below. We poured our whole hearts into these, and we made them for the people who truly listen. Thank you for being one of them. Della Marie Voss came from a family of people who had worked with their hands for as long as anyone remembered. Her mother, Josephine Voss, had been a seamstress in a mill town in western Massachusetts called Adams Hollow. Josephine had learned to sew from her own mother, who had worked the garment trade in Fall River in the 1950s, and had raised 4 daughters on a single Singer sewing machine and a steady willingness to mend what other people had given up on. Josephine had inherited the machine when her mother died, and she had taken in alterations from the church ladies and the funeral parlor across the river for 19 years. She could blind stitch a hem so well that the seam disappeared into the fabric. She could save a button by sewing it back through the old holes so it sat exactly where the coat remembered it. She could patch a child's winter coat with scraps from the remnant bin so carefully that the patches looked like part of the original design. Della's father was a man from the island of Fogo in Cape Verde named Thomas Voss. He had come to New Bedford in 1998 with a cousin and had worked the boats out of the harbor there for 11 years, mostly on a scalloper called the St. Anthony that ran deep water trips to Georges Bank. He met Josephine at a church social in 2002, married her the following spring, and brought her back to Adams Hollow to live in the narrow second-floor apartment above the laundromat on Beckett Street. He was gone at sea for 3 weeks at a time and home for 1. When he was home, the apartment smelled like diesel and salt, and the strong black coffee he made on the stove with a small tin pot his own mother had given him before he left Fogo. When Della was 9 years old, the St. Anthony did not come back from a February trip, and a man in a Coast Guard uniform stood on their porch with a folded paper and a quiet voice. And after that, it was just Della and Josephine above the laundromat, and the only thing Della had of her father was a brass ship's compass on a worn brass chain that had been in the pocket of the jacket he left behind. Josephine did not remarry. She kept sewing. She took on more work to cover what Tomas had brought home from the boats. She taught Della to mend and to iron and to patch and to save. She kept a tin box on the kitchen windowsill labeled in pencil for the month after this one, and into it she dropped whatever change was left at the end of each week, sometimes $1, sometimes only a quarter, and when the electricity bill came due there was always just enough. She kept a second list taped to the inside of the kitchen cupboard door. It was a list of everyone who had ever done a kindness for them. The neighbor who lent them a space heater, the diner owner who sent home leftover bread, the old woman at the church who passed them a coat for Della one October with no questions. Josephine wrote the names down so she would remember to repay the kindnesses if she ever could, and so Della would grow up knowing that a debt of gratitude was the only kind of debt worth keeping careful books on. Josephine got sick when Della was 17. A slow sickness at first, a cough that wouldn't leave, a weight that fell off her shoulders and hips in pieces. By the time the clinic in Pittsfield finally gave it a name, there was very little anyone could do. Della left her senior year of high school in March to sit beside her mother's bed and read aloud from a battered paperback of Willa Cather stories that Josephine had kept on the shelf since her own girlhood. Josephine died on a Tuesday morning in April of Della's 18th year. The rent was due on Friday. Della did what her mother had taught her to do, which was to go to work. She got a job bussing tables at a diner called Marla's on Route 8, where a woman named Marla Petrosian ran the kitchen with her sleeves rolled and her hair pinned up in a loose gray bun. Marla was 56 years old, the widow of a Greek fisherman from Gloucester named Andreas, who had died in 2014, and she had been running the diner alone for 7 years. She did not hire Della out of pity. She hired her because Della had shown up on a Wednesday afternoon with clean boots and a polite handshake and had asked for any work, inside or outside, that Marla had to give. Marla had watched her for an hour and then offered her the busser shift and a plate of eggs for free. Della also cleaned rooms at a motel off the interstate where the owner paid cash and asked no questions. For nearly 3 years, she kept her head down, and she kept the apartment above the laundromat even as the rent climbed and the landlord changed twice, and the laundromat downstairs closed and was replaced by a vape shop whose neon sign buzzed through her floor at night. She saved what she could. She dropped coins into her own version of her mother's tin box. She added names to her own version of her mother's list. Marla Petrosian was the first name on it. In February of her 21st year, the building was sold again, and the new owner sent a letter in a flat envelope. Della found the letter taped to the apartment door when she came home from her shift at the motel. The tape was the kind that leaves a sticky residue on paint. The letter said, in one short paragraph with no signature at the top, "Notice of termination of tenancy. This building is being converted to short-term rentals effective March 30th. You have until that date to vacate the premises. No extensions will be granted. No forwarding address will be maintained. Please leave the keys in the kitchen on your departure." There was a printed name at the bottom and a phone number for a property management company in Springfield. Della read the letter twice. She tried the building's front door downstairs to make sure the locks hadn't already been changed. They hadn't. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time and looked at the photograph of her parents on her dresser, a picture taken in front of the St. Anthony when Della was 4. Her mother's tin box was still on the kitchen windowsill. It had $6.82 in it. She spent the next month doing what her mother would have told her to do. She sold the sewing machine to a woman in Pittsfield who collected vintage Singers for $80. She sold the kitchen table and the 2 matching chairs and the little lamp with the pleated shade to a used furniture store on the edge of town for another $45. She gave her mother's Willa Cather paperback to Marla at the diner because Marla had always asked about the stories. On the last day, she packed 2 changes of clothes, a wool cardigan, the photograph of her parents in front of the St. Anthony, and her father's brass compass on its brass chain, into the canvas shoulder bag she had sewn herself the summer after her mother died. She slept 2 nights in the back booth of Marla's diner. Marla did not charge her for coffee and brought her a plate of eggs and home fries in the morning without being asked. On the 3rd morning, Marla slid a folded newspaper across the counter and tapped a small notice near the bottom of the classified page with one short finger. "Look at this one," Marla said. "Up in Maine. I used to spend summers up that way when I was a girl, before Andreas, before the diner. The whole county was nothing but pine trees and lobster boats." Della read the notice. It was from a place called Pelham County, on the down east coast of Maine, and it listed 6 abandoned properties being sold for nominal fees to clear them off the tax rolls. An old Grange Hall, a 1-room post office, a fire watch tower, a salt shed, a barn on a hayfield, and at the bottom of the list, an old ferry house on a stretch of cove called Gray Harbor, with a note that said it had been closed since the Pelham Bridge opened in 1962. Price, $10. "A ferry house," Della said. "The kind of quiet that gives things back to you," Marla said. "That's what I remember about up there. The quiet." She paused. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and took out a folded $20 bill and pressed it into Della's hand along with the newspaper. "10 for the building. 10 for the road. And you call me when you get there, so I know you're alive. Do you hear me?" Della nodded. She could not speak for a moment. She put the 20 in the front pocket of her canvas bag, where she would not forget it. The bus from Adams Hollow to Portland took 7 hours. From Portland, a smaller bus ran north and east through towns whose names Della had never heard, each one smaller than the last until she was the only passenger left. The driver let her off at a crossroads in the drizzling dusk and pointed down a road that ran toward the water. "County office is 2 miles down in the white building," he said. "Ferry house is another 3 past that. Watch for the cove." Della walked. The drizzle became a steady cold rain. The wool cardigan grew heavy on her shoulders, and her boots soaked through at the laces. The road bent around a stand of black spruce, and then the land fell away, and there was the cove, a gray curve of water under a gray sky, gulls wheeling low, the smell of salt and seaweed and old wood. She had never seen the ocean from the land before. Her father had worked it, and her father had died in it. And here it was, plain and patient as a sleeping animal. The county office was a single-story clapboard building with a hand-painted sign. Inside, a woman in her 60s named Harriet Benoit sat behind a counter with a mug of tea and a crossword folded open. Harriet took in the wet bag and the soaked boots and the young face with the rain on it, and her expression did not change toward pity or toward dismissal. "You hear about the Ferry house?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You know it's been empty since '62. Roof's partly gone, no power, no water that anyone's tested in 60 years. "Yes, ma'am, I have $10. Harriet looked at her a long moment. Then she pulled a deed book from a shelf behind her and turned to a page that had been waiting. "Sign here, and here, and here." Della signed Della Marie Voss in her mother's careful hand. She placed the $10 bill on the counter. Harriet picked it up, folded it once, tucked it into a metal cash box, and stamped the deed with a brass stamp that made a soft, flat sound. "It's yours," Harriet said. "I'll drive you down. That rain will kill you before you get there on foot." The ferry house stood at the end of a short gravel spit that jutted into Gray Harbor. It was a 2-story building of weathered cedar shingles, silver gray from a lifetime of salt wind, with a peaked roof and a squared wheelhouse rising from the center like a small square crown. A covered waiting porch wrapped the seaward side. The windows were boarded with plywood gone soft at the edges. A faded sign above the door read, "Pelham, Cove Ferry, Est Sachs, 1897. A rust-orange life ring hung by one rope from a nail. Below the building, the old ferry slip sloped into the water, its pilings green with weed and barnacle. Harriet unlocked the padlock and handed Della the key. "There's a cot in the back room if the mice haven't claimed it," she said. "Kerosene lantern on the shelf, matches in the tin. I'll come back tomorrow with some things." Della stepped inside alone. The front room was the old passenger waiting area. A long bench along one wall, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, a ticket window with a wooden shutter pulled down. The floorboards were wide pine, scuffed to a soft gray where 60 years of feet had shuffled across them waiting for the boat. The air smelled like cold tar and cedar and the faint mineral ghost of seawater. She set her bag down on the bench, and she felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, which was the feeling of not being afraid of the next hour. She found the kerosene lantern on the shelf and the box of matches in the tin, and she nursed a small flame into life, and she walked the building slowly by its yellow light. The back room had the cot Harriet had mentioned, and a small iron stove, and a shelf with 3 tin cups and a chipped enamel basin. A narrow stair in the corner climbed to the second floor, which was a single long room with the squared wheelhouse rising above it. In the wheelhouse were the old ferry controls, a spoked wooden wheel, a brass throttle lever green with verdigris, a speaking tube, and a tall cabinet of oiled oak built into the forward wall beneath the windows. The cabinet was the compass binnacle, the housing where the ferry's magnetic compass had sat in its gimbal. The glass dome on top was cracked but intact. The cabinet below had two small doors held shut by a brass hasp and a tiny corroded padlock the size of a walnut. Della knelt in front of it. The padlock came apart in her fingers at the first pull. She opened the doors. Inside the cabinet, beneath the compass mount, was a flat drawer fitted snug to the bottom of the housing. She slid it out. It moved with the slow reluctance of wood that had been closed a very long time. Inside the drawer was an oilcloth bundle and a stack of envelopes tied with a faded blue ribbon. She carried the drawer down to the waiting bench where the lantern light was steadier. She untied the oilcloth first. Inside were bundled banknotes, old-style United States currency, some of the large format bills from before 1929, and some newer, all in careful stacks held together with paper bands that had yellowed and crumbled at the edges. She counted slowly. 20s, 50s, and a small stack of hundreds. When she was done counting and recounting, she sat very still on the bench. The total was $11,460. She set the money aside and opened the first envelope. The paper was thin and the ink was brown with age, but the handwriting was clear and even, the hand of a man who had written many letters in his life. The letter was dated June 14, 1962. To whoever finds this, my name is Ellis Crandall. I have been the ferryman at Pelham Cove from 1921 until today. My father, Samuel Crandall, kept this boat before me from 1897 until 1921, and his hands built the slip you are standing on. Together, we have carried the people of this county across this harbor for 65 years. Today, the new bridge 3 miles north opens to traffic, and the county has informed me that the ferry will not run again after Friday. I am 68 years old. My wife Maribel passed in 1959 of a sickness the doctors in Bangor could not name. We were not given children. There is no one to pass this work to, and the building will be locked and forgotten when I turn the key for the last time on Friday evening. I have saved a portion of every fare I ever took for a thing I called my waiting fund, because a ferryman spends his life waiting for the tide, waiting for the fog to lift, waiting for the last passenger on the last run. I meant the fund for a proper retirement that I now find I do not want. I am leaving it here in the compass cabinet because I believe that one day someone will come to this building who needs a beginning the way I once needed one. I came to this cove in 1921 with nothing but a bad suit and my father's name. The ferry gave me a life. Let it give you one, too. Be kind to the building. Be kind to the cove. The gulls remember. The tide remembers. A waiting place is a kind of faith, and faith does not break just because the boat has stopped running. Yours truly, Ellis Crandall, ferryman, Gray Harbor, Maine. June 1962. Della sat on the bench in the yellow lantern light, and she read the letter twice, and then a third time. She did not cry. Her mother had taught her that tears were a private weather, and not always the right answer to a gift. She folded the letter carefully along its old creases and placed it back in its envelope, and she said aloud, to the empty waiting room, and to the gulls outside, and to whoever might be listening, "Thank you, Mr. Crandall. I will try." If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, what is a place you have waited in that you still remember? The rebuilding took patient months. Della spent the first week walking the building in daylight, making a list in a pocket notebook of everything that needed doing. The roof over the wheelhouse had to be reshingled before the autumn storms. The boarded windows had to come down and new panes had to go in. The pot-bellied stove needed its flue cleaned. The well behind the building, when Harriet came back with a county inspector, proved to be sound. And with a new hand pump, it gave cold, clean water that tasted faintly of iron and stone. Della did not spend Ellis Crandall's money recklessly. She kept most of it in a lockbox Harriet helped her buy at the hardware store in the next town over. She spent it in small, careful amounts, a bundle of cedar shingles, a bucket of tar, a second-hand kerosene cook stove, a proper mattress, a wool blanket, 2 pairs of work gloves, a claw hammer and a handsaw, and a box of galvanized nails. She learned to shingle a roof by watching a video on the library computer in Ellsworth and by making mistakes and correcting them. She learned to glaze a window by asking an old man at the hardware store who remembered how his father had done it. She learned that the tide came in twice a day and that you could set a clock by it if you knew what to look for. The people of Pelham County began to notice her. Harriet came by every Wednesday with a thermos of tea and a tin of ginger cookies her sister baked. A lobsterman from the next cove over, named Arlo Trask, took to leaving a pair of fresh lobsters in a bucket on her porch once a week without ever knocking. A retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Odette Beaumont drove down the gravel spit one afternoon in a station wagon full of curtains she had sewn herself, and she said, "Every house needs curtains to tell the light when to come in," and she would not let Della pay for them. A teenage boy from the village named Cody, whose father had taught him carpentry, spent 3 Saturdays helping her rehang the front door. Ellis Crandall came to Della slowly, in fragments from the people who had known him. Harriet told her that Ellis had been a quiet man with big hands and an old-fashioned courtesy, who always took his cap off when a woman stepped onto the ferry and always helped children count their fare coins carefully, so they would not feel hurried. Arlo, who had been a boy on this coast when Ellis was still running the boat, remembered that Ellis kept a tin of peppermints in his pocket for the school children on the morning run, and that he never charged a widow the fare on the day of a funeral. Mrs. Beaumont remembered that Ellis and Maribel had lived in a small white cottage a mile inland, and that Maribel had grown tomatoes and kept Rhode Island red hens, and that after Maribel died, Ellis had moved into the back room of the ferry house itself because the cottage had grown too quiet to stay in. For his last 3 years, he had lived in the same room where Della now slept, and he had kept the stove going and the lantern trimmed, and he had run the boat on its schedule until the day the bridge opened. The more Della learned, the more the building itself seemed to hold Ellis Crandall in its walls. She found, tucked behind the pot-bellied stove, a small carved wooden figure of a harbor seal, the kind of thing a man might whittle between runs. She found, pressed flat between the pages of an old tide table in the ticket drawer, a photograph of a dark-haired woman in a summer dress standing beside a vegetable garden which Harriet confirmed was Maribel. She found, scratched into the underside of the ticket window shelf in a careful small hand, the initials E, C, and M.C. inside a lopsided heart, a piece of private tenderness that had been waiting in the dark for 64 years for somebody to notice it. By late July, the roof was tight. By August, the windows held glass. By September, the waiting room had a swept floor and the pot-bellied stove was working, and Della had learned to bank a fire that would hold through the cold coastal nights. She made a small bedroom in the back room and set her mother's photograph on the shelf above the cot, along with her father's brass compass on its chain. The first quart of firewood came from a man in the next valley named Earl Dutch, who delivered seasoned oak in a pickup with a cracked tailgate and would not take more than half his usual price when he heard whose building Della was heating. Earl had been a boy in Pelham County in the late 1950s and remembered crossing the harbor on Ellis Crandall's ferry to visit his grandmother on the far side. He stood on the gravel spit for a long time that first afternoon, looking at the building, his hands in the pockets of his canvas coat. "Ellis charged my grandmother a nickel and me nothing," he said finally. "He said children didn't pay until their feet could touch the deck without the boat rocking under them." Then he unloaded the wood without saying anything else, and he refused the tea Della offered him, and he got back in his truck and drove away. Della stacked the firewood against the south wall of the waiting porch in careful rows, the way her mother had taught her to stack things that needed to last. Smallest pieces on the outside so the stack would not collapse, a gap of 2 inches between the bottom row and the boards of the porch to let air move underneath. When the stack was done, she stood back and looked at it and thought that there was a kind of honesty in a well-stacked woodpile that she had not appreciated before. It was the honesty of work that had been done correctly, that would hold, that would not need to be redone in a month by someone else. Cody Whitlock, the teenage boy whose father had taught him carpentry, came back on a Saturday in mid-September with a length of white oak in the bed of his truck and a quiet determination to build Della a proper new front door. His father Raymond came with him. Raymond was in his 40s, a stocky man with permanently sawdusted boots, and he had learned his trade from his own father, who had built half the barns in Pelham County in the 1970s. Raymond looked at the old weathered door, ran his hand along the rotted bottom rail, and said to his son, "Show her how we do a mortise and tenon joint for a door that has to last longer than we do." They spent the whole Saturday on it. Cody cut the tenons with a back saw while his father watched. Raymond shaped the top rail with a plane, the long curls of pale oak falling around his boots. When the door was fitted and hung on its new iron hinges and swung closed against the jamb with a soft, heavy sound, Raymond stood back and nodded once and said to Della, "That's a door Ellis Crandall would have approved of." And then he and Cody got into the truck and drove away before Della could find a way to thank them. Harriet Benoit did not come only on Wednesdays. She came on Sundays too with the small carved wooden seal Della had found behind the stove, which Harriet had taken home one week to clean with a soft cloth and a little mineral oil. She came with news from the county office, who had been born, who had died, which bridge had been closed for repairs, which road the frost heaves had ruined again. She came with a set of tide tables from 1961 that she had found in a box in the basement of the courthouse, stamped on the cover, Pelham Cove Ferry, property of the ferryman. She came, most of all, with the particular kind of quiet company that older women are sometimes able to give younger ones, which is the company of someone who has already weathered most of the things the younger woman is still afraid of, and who will not pretend those things are not coming, but will also not pretend they cannot be survived. Marla Petrosian drove up from Adams Hollow on the last weekend of September in her old Honda. She arrived with a carload of things she had saved from Della's apartment before the eviction, her mother's sewing box, which Marla had quietly paid the new landlord $20 to let her take, the photograph of Tomas and Josephine in front of the St. Anthony that had been left on the dresser, a small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to Della's grandmother in Cape Verde and had somehow been overlooked in the packing. Marla stayed 3 days. She slept on a second cot Della had set up in the back room. She helped Della hem a set of linen curtains that Mrs. Beaumont had brought down the week before, but that had not quite fit the new windows. She sat on the waiting porch at sunset and watched the cove go pink and said almost nothing, which was the best thing she could have said. On the morning she left, she stood beside the open door of the Honda and she said, "Your mother would be proud of you, Della. She would also tell you to sweep the floor more often." And then she hugged her, and she drove away, and Della sat down on the front step of the Ferry house and finally let herself cry, for the first time in a long time. And she did not stop until the sun was gone. In October, the first real cold came, and with it the northern light that turned the cove into hammered pewter at sunset. Della took to sitting on the waiting porch in the last hour of each day with a tin cup of tea and the wool cardigan pulled tight. The gulls wheeled over the old slip the way they had wheeled for Ellis Crandall and for his father Samuel before him. The tide went out and came in and went out again. On a clear evening in late October, with the sky gone to rose and copper over the black spruce, Della sat on the porch with Harriet beside her and Arlo's bucket of lobsters steaming on a newspaper between them. She thought about her mother, Josephine, who had taped a list of kindnesses to the inside of a kitchen cupboard door and had taught her daughter that a debt of gratitude was the only kind of debt worth keeping careful books on. She thought about her father, Tomas, who had crossed an ocean to marry a seamstress in a mill town, and whose compass had ridden in her bag from Adams Hollow to this porch. She thought about Ellis Crandall in his last June, writing a letter to a stranger he would never meet, folding it into a drawer and trusting that the cove would deliver it. She understood now that her mother had not been angry when she got sick, and that her father had not meant to leave, and that the landlord in Adams Hollow who had taped the eviction notice to her door had been, without knowing it, doing her a kind of accidental kindness. Some doors close because the people closing them cannot stand to keep them open. But sometimes a closed door is the same thing as a hand on the back, pushing you toward the next one. That's the thing about waiting places. A ferry house is not just a building. It is a kind of promise kept in wood and cedar and iron, a promise that if you stand here long enough, the boat will come, or something will come, or a stranger 60 years in the future will walk up the gravel spit in the rain and put her hand on the door. A waiting place holds the faith that the people who used it could not always hold for themselves. It holds it in the grain of its floorboards, and in the ring of the old ferry bell, and in the sealed drawer of a compass cabinet. And when the person it has been waiting for finally arrives, the building does not speak, because buildings do not speak. It simply shows her the drawer. Alice Crandall had waited for Delavos for 60 years without knowing her name. Josephine had waited for her the whole length of her own short life. Tomas had waited in the shape of a brass compass kept in a jacket pocket. Marla Petrosian had waited in the back booth of a diner with a folded $20 bill in her apron. Harriet Benoit had waited behind a county counter with a deed book already turned to the right page. Even Arlo Trask and Mrs. Odette Beaumont and Cody the carpenter's son had been waiting, in their own quiet ways, for the young woman who would walk the gravel spit in the cold drizzle and sign her name in her mother's careful hand. Della Voss was 21 years old and homeless. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned ferry house on the coast of Maine. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to support the channel and help us keep telling quiet road stories, there is a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description below. It is not required, it is not expected, it is just there for anyone who wants to. Every cup of coffee goes straight back into making the next story. Thank you for listening. See you on the next Quiet Road.